Jeff Benedict. Jeff, nice to have you back on the show. It's been a while.
It has. It's great to be back, guys.
You have been a very busy man, no surprise. You generally are. In fact, you have put together a fantastic book on the life of Steve Young called QB, My Life Behind the Spiral. It comes out on October 11th on Steve Young's birthday. What are you doing right now in this whole promotional tour for this book, Jeff?
Well, this is, kind of I think a monumental process that we've been through. Steve's, done a tremendous job writing his autobiography. It's just a very inspiring account of his life. I think whether you're a BYU fan or a 49er fan or just someone who, wants to be uplifted and motivated, it's a great book, and it's a few weeks away from being out. So right now, what's going on is just a lot of build-up to when the book's released, and Steve will be doing some book signings in various parts of the country, Utah, California, New York. I mean, a lot of different cities, actually, and a lot of events, I think, that will really put the book on a lot of people's radar.
Jeff, how did this project originally start?
Interestingly enough, it started 5 years ago. I was writing a cover story on Jabari Parker for Sports Illustrated. This was the one when Jabari was still in high school, and I profiled him when he was in high school. And my editor had asked me if I thought Jabari Parker was going to go on a mission, and I said, I don't know. He was only 17 at the time, and the decision hadn't been made. And the editor had an idea, which I thought was really interesting, especially looking back on it now, was that he said, it's going to be a big question on our readers' minds. I'd like you to go out and interview some of the more prominent Mormon athletes who have had to grapple with that decision over the years, and why don't you start with Steve Young and Danny Ainge? And so I called Steve, and I had never met Steve in my life. I'd never spoken to him. But the interesting thing is we actually had a tremendous amount in common. We were both from Connecticut. We both were in school at roughly the same time. We were both the only Mormons in our community. I had looked up to him, like an older brother I didn't have when I was in high school. And even though I wasn't a BYU fan as a kid, I was a huge Steve Young fan. And so to be interviewing him for the magazine was an interesting proposition for me, and I was really looking forward to it. And it was at the end of that phone call, that interview, that he asked me if I would have an interest in helping him compile his life history.
So you had never spoken to him, and then by the end of your first conversation, he's like, "Oh, will you write my life history?"
There's a little more to it than that, but meaning that is what happened, but there's some more context there to that, part of which stems from our roots in Connecticut and having a common friend who Steve refers to in his book, in his acknowledgement page. But there was a friend that I had in Connecticut and that he had from Connecticut, and he was instrumental actually in encouraging Steve to potentially work with me, and so I didn't know that backstory when I called Steve to do the interview for Sports Illustrated.
New York Times best-selling author Jeff Benedict with us on BYU Sports Nation. This is a loaded question, but what did you learn about Steve Young that maybe you didn't already know through writing this autobiography?
Well, you'd need to do like a 3-hour program for me to answer that. Because, what I've learned in my career is that usually the assumptions and things that you have about people that are visible, and athletes are visible, are usually wrong. And not that I had a lot of assumptions about Steve, but as I said, I grew up watching him from the time I was a boy, because I admired the way he lived his life. I was more interested in the way he lived his life than the kind of football player he was. So, but the fact is, Steve is a very private, reserved person, and so my knowledge of him was very superficial. And whenever you do a biography, and I've done a bunch of them now, when you actually delve deep into someone's life, you learn a tremendous amount of things about a person that not only you didn't know, but pretty much nobody else knows. And in Steve's case, those revelations were endearing to me in terms of how I felt about him. I looked up to him when I started this project, but by the time I was done, where I am now, I feel more like, he's the older brother I never had.
Jeff, this has a lot of personal stuff in it from Steve, in particular, more about kind of the anxiety that he had throughout his playing career and growing up. Was Steve at first hesitant maybe about going into that stuff?
Well, I mean, to be honest, Steve never got into this because he wanted to write a book. What he asked me to help him do was write his life history, not for publication, but more as something personal and private for his family. His children have never had the opportunity to see him play football because he wasn't a father until after he retired. And so it's kind of fascinating that a guy who has one of the most remarkable careers in the history of the NFL, and he has kids who weren't there to be part of that. And I think that was his motivation. It wasn't to publish a book. The idea to publish the book was something that was coming more from me, not from Steve at all. But the more I learned about Steve and we were digging into his life and, really, I was going through his journal entries and his scrapbooks and interviewing. I did, hundreds of interviews with all kinds of people in his life. And I kept saying that, look, I mean, I'm not trying to blow smoke. I'm just saying that I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never come across a story that's as inspiring as this. And people are going to be blown away when they read what your life has really been like, if you're willing to share it. But he was, understandably reluctant, and I admired that in him too. And but yes, you're right. The book is very personal. It's an incredibly intimate account of Steve, and my thinking about it as we were working on it was I really wanted readers to have the feeling that they were inside his helmet, not just when he's running down the field being chased by defenders, but when he's off the field and he's by himself and he's alone and he's, as he often was, and he's going through what it means to be Steve Young and to be the most visible Mormon athlete in the world, to be playing behind Joe Montana and trying to take that job, to be playing behind Jim McMahon and having all the expectations that are here that nobody really understands what that's like. And the idea of an autobiography is to try to give readers that experience of what it is like to be you, and that's a tall order, and it's amazing that he's done it.
Jeff, do you have a story in it that sticks out that you can share with our listeners right now that might really encourage them to go out and purchase this book and look into it some more?
I do. I mean, my favorite stories from Steve's life, and this is just because of where I'm from, my favorite stories and the favorite chapters to write were the ones from his childhood, most of which took place in Greenwich, Connecticut. And one of my favorite stories is he was assigned by his bishop when he was a young teenager, or 16 or 17, to make some visits to a girl who was in a hospital in Connecticut with a life-threatening illness and she was alone. She'd come from the West, and she didn't have any family there. And so Steve was assigned to go, and he made those visits, and he became like the only friend that she had, and she knew she was going to die. And there's this incredibly poignant moment where Steve's in the hospital room alone with her, and she's telling him that she knows she's going to go, and he's trying to keep it together and keep her together. And he gets very detailed in that account of what that was like, and she does pass away, in fact, that night. When I was working on that particular scene with him in the hospital room with the doctor and the nurses and this girl, to me it was just an incredibly just window into the life of this young man who most people know as a great football player, but seeing the building blocks in his boyhood, it really helps explain why and how he became the kind of leader he was on the field. And those are the stories that people don't know about Steve Young because they've never been told.
That's powerful stuff. And there was another more lighthearted story where I guess when he was the original Harry Potter, he was living under the stairwell or something, sleeping there at night at his sister's house or something. Can you clue us in on that one?
You guys I'm glad to see that you guys read advance copy because that is that's a story about when Steve was playing for the 49ers and he was attending law school at BYU. And it's a great, I mean, that whole period of time is just a fantastic, some of those stories are absolutely, knee-smacking funny when you're reading about him, and that's one of the things I like about him is Steve is a very serious person, but he's also got a fantastic sense of humor and tends to make people smile and laugh, and I think that's why people like to be around him.
Jeff Benedict, award-winning author with us on BYU Sports Nation, is set to release QB, My Life Behind the Spiral, autobiography for Steve Young on October 11th. Jeff, when and where will this book be available to all fans across BYU Sports Nation and to readers across the country?
The book will be available everywhere October 11th. Now you can pre-order the book on Amazon. It's already up there and very visible there. I've also got a new Instagram page called Author Jeff Benedict, and starting October 11th, I'll be putting up video clips and images from Steve's book tour that he'll be doing starting in New York on the 11th, and it'll give fans a way to sort of follow him through the tour.
Jeff, fantastic work as always. We look forward to seeing this book just absolutely kill it on the market, and we appreciate the insight to what goes into a major project like this.
Well, thanks, guys. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.